Let us pray. Dear Father, we pray that you would fill this room now with your life-giving Spirit, that you would cast away our fear, that you would lessen any terror that we might have, that we might open ourselves to each other, to your word, and to the ways that we can grow. We thank you for your presence in our midst. We thank you for sustaining us through these last days. And we pray for that deepened trust that is the secret of living without fear. Into your hands we give these next moments of our lives. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Everybody has a fish story, I'm told, and the Gospels actually have two that I want us to work with tonight. Chris Heikema said to me when I first announced that I was going to do this series that she heard once that the reason people didn't believe in the miracle stories of Jesus was that they were told by fishermen, and fishermen are notoriously not very reliable. And tonight what I want us to do is to look at two stories that in some ways are alike, but in other ways are very different. And both of them involve Jesus' interaction with that animal level of creation. And interestingly enough, both these stories serve as kind of bracket for Jesus' empowering of his disciples. In the first story from Luke's Gospel, that you will find that after this experience is when the people that had been intrigued with Jesus really decided to take him seriously. And at the end of the story it says they left everything and followed Jesus. The last story, which also involves a miraculous catch of fish, is at the very end of Jesus' life and history, after his resurrection. It's almost the commissioning of the apostles to go and to continue the work that Jesus had begun. And so both of these stories, similar and yet different, in a sense give us a sense of how Jesus was working with his disciples. I said when I first began this series that there are 41 miracle stories in the Gospels, and I could not deal with all of them. And so what I've done is to take 5 stories that show Jesus' mastery of nature, and tonight we'll kind of end that first series. Next week I'll begin 5 stories where Jesus dramatically healed bodies of people who were sick. And then in January, I want to come back with a 5-part series where we will look at how Jesus dealt with mental disturbances, and then look at some of the stories where the most life-giving miracles of all took place, namely when Jesus raised people from the dead. And as we have made our way through these stories, I've had one theme that I have continued to hammer away at, and that is that the miracles that Jesus did, the word parables that he taught and the deed parables that he did, all of these were for one purpose and one purpose only. And that was showing us the true face of God and giving us that sense that the mystery that calls all of us into being and sustains us is something good, that is one that we can trust. John Milton, the medieval writer, kind of outlines the movement of the salvation story by saying in the beginning there was paradise, and we've talked about that on Wednesday night after Wednesday night, how the one that had life and possessed life decided that it was too good to keep and therefore decided to share life. So the Holy One became the generous one, and generosity is how creation came into being. And heaven and earth were one in those beginning times. In fact, earth was simply an extension of heaven. And because the law of love was the law that ruled all of life, there was great paradise, there was great joy. Creatures lived together in harmony. Husband and wife found great delight in each other. The humankind and the animals walked with God in the cool of the day. Where love was supreme and where there was no fear, it was a veritable paradise where God's kind of joy, the joy of being, the joy of having, the joy of doing, was lived out. And then we know from the biblical story that the paradise that had been called into being by love was shattered. And heaven and earth, instead of being one, became utterly polarized, and paradise was lost. And paradise was lost because a serpent came and said, "The one behind it all is not a generous lover, but this one is rather a selfish tyrant. This one has created to exploit and to abuse. This one has called you into being to do bad things to you and with you. This one does not care for you whatsoever." And so that message, that accusation against the nature of God, gave rise to fear. And fear is the matrix of all things destructive. I think I'm being true to the biblical story to use the contemporary analogy that what Johnny Cochran did for the image of the Los Angeles Police Department, the serpent did to the image of God. Cochran convinced worlds of people that that structure was totally unjust, you could not trust it, that they were not up to good and therefore were to be feared. It's the same word that was put out on the nature of the ultimate reality, that God is not something that is generous and wants us to know joy, but God is exploitive, cannot be trusted, and whenever that kind of fear gets loose in the psyche, it makes everything look suspicious. Everything that goes bump in the night you assume is a threat. Everybody you see, you think this person is undoubtedly trying to do me in. You see, love has the power to cast out fear, but never forget that fear also has the power to cast out love. And that when we are in the grip of panic, those things that are most godlike in us, the capacities for joy, for mercy, for creativity, they evaporate. And we become fearful, suspicious, and destructive entities of each other. Those of you who were here last week, forgive me for retelling just one little anecdote that I think does give us a clear image as to what fear does to our kind. I told last week about when I was living in Louisville back in the 60s, a young man from a lower middle-income neighborhood was drafted to go to Vietnam. He was a very good soldier, got into one of the elite corps, was a Green Beret, I believe, and his division was pulled back very suddenly from Vietnam to Fort Knox, which is just south of Louisville, for special training, and they came back so quickly they didn't have time to apprise his family of his coming back. And so he decided to surprise them. And so they got into Fort Knox early in the afternoon. They went through all the paperwork. He was given a 2-day pass. And so just as the sun was going down, he catches a bus to Louisville. And from the bus station, he takes a taxi out to his house. He's going to surprise his family. But by this time, it's about 11 o'clock at night. And it's in a neighborhood where everybody had become exceedingly fearful. There were locks on every door and bars on every window. And he gets up on his own front porch, coming to surprise his parents, and he knocks on the door. And his father, all he can see is this silhouette of a stranger knocking on the door. He goes and gets a 12-gauge shotgun and shoots the boy. What he had avoided in Vietnam happened at his own home, on his own front porch, because that's what fear does to us. Everybody turns into a threat. Suspicion becomes the atmosphere that we breathe. And fear is the matrix of the unmaking of creation and turning it back into absolute frightful chaos. Well, as we know the biblical story, God's response to this terrible, terrible perversion of what he had intended for creation, God's response is absolutely amazing. Instead of giving up on us, as would be humanly conceivable, there was in the Holy One this incredible, incredible reach of love. When we ceased to be loving, God did not cease to be what God is. God remained loving in the face of our turning absolutely against the divine design. And so beginning with Abraham and coming through the history of Israel and coming to its climax in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, God proceeds to try to regain paradise, to recreate the dream that he'd always had, the peaceable kingdom where everyone would live together in generosity and live together in love and cooperation. And so love re-entered history. He came to Abraham and said, "I want to bless you," which is exactly what you find in the first chapter of Genesis, the reason back of creation. And in Jesus of Nazareth, love took human form and entered this ghetto of fearfulness which we had created. In fact, years ago I heard John 3:16 Translated into modern lingo, they say, God so loved the world that he let his son Jesus be bussed into the ghetto called earth. Let his heart of his heart go into the realm that had become destructive because of our fearfulness. And every parable that Jesus ever told and every miracle that he ever performed were in the service of helping us see that the serpent had told us a lie. The serpent had given us the wrong feeling for the nature of God. And he came to show us the Father. He came to show us what the face of God really is. And what that means, he came to restore trust. He came to restore a sense of family among us all, including the animal and the plant life. He came to cast out our fear and get us back into the way that it really is. And the story tonight is yet one more way that Jesus is trying to say to people, what you were told about God by the serpent is not right. Here is the way God really and truly is. The first fishing story is from the 5th chapter of Luke. I'll read it quickly because it'll give you a sense of what we're working with tonight. Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, that's the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. And then he sat down in the boat and taught the crowd. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water. Let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night long and have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. And when Simon saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish which they had taken in. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners of Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." And when they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Jesus is imaging for us here the deep truth about God. I want you to notice, first of all, the practical, down-to-earth wisdom of this first gesture. By this time, the word of Jesus as a healer and as a teacher had begun to circulate. Crowds were pressing in on him. If you've ever been to the Holy Land up on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, there is a kind of natural amphitheater, a little cove. I've been there, where tradition has it that this particular miracle took place. And the people were so pressing in on Jesus that they were pushing him into the water, and it was keeping him from doing what he wanted to do. So he sees 2 fishing boats that had been used the night before. The fishermen are tired, but they're washing their nets. And he asks Simon if he could borrow his boat, and he puts it a little way from the shore where the people could not get to him. And then from the boat, Jesus was able to teach and to heal without being interrupted. Back when we looked at the story of the feeding of the 5,000, I pointed out that Jesus had everybody to sit down before he started distributing the food, which is a wonderful strategic form of crowd control. Here is another indication that what you have in Jesus is the very wisdom of the Creator. God made this world, and he knows how it can work for joy. There is a practical down-to-earthness of how things work together the way they were intended to work, harmoniously, bringing joy to everybody that is affected. The story begins by Jesus solving what could have been a very nasty problem by doing something very strategic, getting in a boat, putting enough distance where the crowd could settle down, and then he was able to teach them. And I would suggest to you that there is in the heart of the Creator not a desire to exploit us or abuse us. He really gave us this world and meant for it to work according to love in ways that would be blessing for us all. Then after he has finished his teaching, I see Jesus doing something that bespeaks a kind of reciprocity. He had borrowed Simon's boat, and he was appreciative of that, and so he turns to Simon And he says, get your nets and let's launch out into the deep and let's catch some fish. Now what this means, I think, is that Jesus wanted to do something for Simon, just like Simon had done something for him. Does that sound like the way an exploitive tyrant would treat somebody else? No, it bespeaks the kind of loving kindness that I think you find at the heart of the eternal. And it's interesting that when Jesus proposes to do something for Simon, since he had done something for him, Simon resists this. Probably several reasons why. First of all, he'd been fishing all night, and he was worn out and tired. But I expect the deeper truth is he somewhat resented a carpenter turned preacher telling him, a fisherman, how to do his work. And so he says, look, we have fished all night, and we know how to do this, and we've been doing this for years. Who are you to be telling us how to do our work? And yet he said, but if you say so, I'll do it. In other words, he was either going to try to show Jesus up and say, you really don't know what you're talking about, or maybe there was already a seed of trust in him that here is a person who represents a wisdom and a power beyond anything I know. And when you trust somebody, you don't have to understand everything they tell you to do, because your trust enables you to go ahead and act believing that that higher wisdom really is in touch with reality. And so they do launch out, and they get out into the middle of the lake. And remember now, this is in the middle of the day, and fish in that little area, in that little lake, because the sun is so hot, usually go very deep in the daytime, which is why they fished at night. That's when the schools of fish came close to the surface. And maybe one of the reasons Simon didn't want to fool with it in the middle of the day is that you just don't catch any fish in a net at that particular time of day. But anyway, they go out in the middle of the day, and Jesus is in the boat, and he says, put the net over on this side. And lo and behold, to the experienced fisherman's absolute amazement, a whole school of fish suddenly materialized around the boat and inside the net. It was so many fish that the boat was about to sink. They signaled to the other boat to come out, and it's more than both of the boats could possibly handle, and they are genuinely amazed that the carpenter who says that God is love really knew how to do their particular discipline better than they. Here again is a reflection that the wisdom of the Creator really does know how to make creation work. Now, as at every one of the miracle stories, we've had to ask ourselves, what really happened? How did this come about? How was Jesus able to speak to the animals, the fish, and suddenly what had not been there a few moments before was there at his beck and call? But once again, I'll have to say to you that I don't know exactly how it happened in terms of scientific description. But what I do believe is that what happened that day is an expression of what love can accomplish in history, when love is what you follow and love is what you do. I want to lay down as a principle to which I will come back again and again, that love is the only power that can overcome evil without imitating evil. That love is the one thing in the world that can take on something that is genuinely fearful and destructive and can absorb that and turn it into something different and give back love instead of hate. And therefore love has the power to overcome evil without imitating evil. Now, you know as well as I that most of the time when an evil is perpetrated against us, our first impulse is to give it a dose of its own medicine. And so somebody comes up and slaps me unjustly on the cheek, and I want to let them know how it feels to be treated that way, so I slap them back, and I've given them a second reason to slap, and so the war dance begins. If, in order to defeat the beast, one becomes a beast, then its bestiality is finally won out. And most of our responses to evil are simply in outrage to imitate it. Now, I could be wrong, and I want to be careful to give this proviso, but I honestly think one of the dynamics in the O.J. Simpson verdict is that there was get back on the part of the black community for all the years of injustice When black people were not treated fairly in our courts, when again and again and again they didn't get what was a just thing. And so now that they have a chance, they're going to give us a taste of what it was really like. And I know that it's a very complex phenomenon. I don't want to over-talk, but I honestly think that there was an element of we'll show them because of what they have done. And what has come to me as I've reflected this week, I feel like this whole episode has set us back in every way. But what I have come to realize is that forgiveness is the only way we're ever going to break this cycle of evil, because if we return evil for evil, we are simply adding to the sum total of evil. That if we don't somehow find a way to make a different kind of response to evil, then it's just going to continue to grow and feed on itself and get more and more destructive. Love is the only power that can overcome evil without imitating evil. Now you need to go back to Genesis and realize that when fear first entered history and panic took possession of the human, and everything became a threat and suspicion became the very essence of the atmosphere, that the story is that creation literally began to fall apart from top to bottom. That is, every facet of creation was affected by fear. God and the humankind used to walk together in the cool of the day. Now that fear had come, the human beings hid away from God. The man and the woman had once looked at each other with ecstasy. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Now they're angrily over against each other, each accusing the other of what had happened. The first two sons that Adam and Eve brought into history, one killed the other, fratricide. The animals caught the fear that was so endemic because of what the serpent had done. And so the predator and the prey began to be the law of the jungle, the way animals related to each other. And even the good earth, which in loving ways had always been producing abundance and had been cooperative with God and humans and animals, even the earth was infected by fearfulness, and it became resistant. And so by the sweat of the brow, humans had to kind of defeat the earth to get food, where when there had been the law of love, everything had worked generously and harmoniously and cooperatively. And what I want to say is that Jesus came to redeem the whole cosmos. He came not only to heal the suspicion between humans and God, but He came to heal the suspicion between the genders. He came to heal the problem that often develops in families between siblings. He came to heal the predator and the prey in the animal heart. And He came even to purge the earth of the fearfulness that makes it destructive. And therefore what I want to suggest is that that day on the Sea of Galilee, when perfect love in a human form entered history, that there in the middle of that lake, Jesus in love called those fish the way a beloved master would have called a pet. And because there was no reason to fear, creation once again began to live by the law of love. And those creatures came to the loving one like people will do when the fear has been cast out, when there's no need to see everybody through suspicious lens and regard everything as a threat. You see, the goal that Jesus came to accomplish is to so show us the face of the Father that there is nothing to fear, and so we can look on each other as brothers and sisters. We can look on the animal kingdom as also part of our family. We can look on the earth as our gracious mother, and love has the power to overcome evil without imitating evil. And therefore I honestly think that what happened that day was that love came to the lake, and for one shining moment we got a glimpse of what it used to be like when it was paradise, and we got a glimpse of what God still wants to bring about, namely the lion lying down with the lamb, the wolf and the child playing together without fear. The peaceable kingdom is what God still dreams and wants to bring into existence. And it's not unrealistic to say that love, unconditional love, has the power to transform evil and absorb it and turn it into something different. I was reading not long ago about a young man whose grandfather, who had been married to his grandmother for 53 years, died. Both of them were in their 80s. Their whole lives had been intertwined together for 5 decades. And the young man was very, very upset that his grandmother just absolutely gave up on life when her husband died. It was as if her reason for living had gotten away. It was as if she just didn't think there was anything left for her. And she became a very bitter and a very shriveled and a very angry person, whereas once she had been very loving. And it got so bad that they had to put her into a nursing home. And he would go to see his grandmother, and she was so different than he had remembered her. And he would try to be of some comfort, but she would rail out at why God had taken her husband and had left her here in the world. And it didn't seem that anything that anybody could do could make her any different. Excuse me. Well, one day he went to see his grandmother. And to his amazement, her whole body language was different. In fact, there was a relaxedness about her that he'd never seen before. So he said to her, "What on earth has happened to you? You even look physically different." And she said, "Well, I couldn't wait for you to come because something very significant did happen to me last night." She said, "In a dream, I dreamed that Jesus himself came and stood at the foot of my bed. And when he came, I asked him what I've always wanted to ask God. Why did you take my husband from me and leave me here?" And she said, "Jesus said to me, you know as well as I that your husband had mastered the course in unconditional love. He was incredibly merciful. He had learned how to be loving in the face of all kinds of situations. He had mastered the course that you were put into this world to learn, and therefore he has graduated, and you have not yet mastered the course, and that's why you have been left to learn." And she said, "As I heard Jesus say that, I realized that that was true. I used to marvel at my husband at how he could be so merciful and so loving, and I realized that I was not. I was selfish, I was harsh, I was judgmental, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, he has gone on because he's learned the lesson we were put in history to learn, and I'm here to finish the course and to learn unconditional love myself." And she said, "I now see why I'm still here and why he's gone, and I intend to master the course." Well, the grandson was amazed. He didn't know how long it would last, but lo and behold, it did last. The old woman lived for 5 more years, and he was absolutely amazed at how that experience and her call to embody unconditional love absolutely transformed her and began to transform the atmosphere about her. The whole nursing home began to feel the difference. He came to see her one day, and she said, "I had the neatest experience today." Said, "Your uncle was very upset with me because he thought I had changed the will, and he came in here and he was so angry I thought he was going to hit me." And she said, "I absorbed his anger, I wrapped it in mercy, and I gave him back love, and it completely disarmed him." She says it takes 2 to fight. When unconditional love is offered back in the face of evil, it can absorb it, it can transform it, and it can do something to the hater. And she said he left here a very different person. We never have been as close as we are now. And for 5 years, she practiced what is the one required course in this particular schoolroom. Love is not an elective. It is the one required course. And the day she died, the people in the nursing home said to the grandson, "You will never know what your grandmother has done for this place in the last 5 years." A nurse said, "Every time I'm with her, I feel like I'm bathed in sunshine. Somehow all of my negative resentments get drained away, and in the countenance of her loving, I find myself less afraid and more capable of loving." Now, I honestly believe that that's not just poetic fantasy. I believe that if you and I could ever glimpse the power of unconditional love, if we could ever see that that's what we were put in here to experience and then to give, William Blake said, "We were put into this world to learn to bear the beams of love, to receive them from unconditional love, and then to give them to other people in the same way." That if you and I could ever believe in the power of unconditional love, and if it could ever dawn on us that when we cease to be loving, God did not cease to be who God is. God stayed unconditional lover in the face of our fearful destructiveness. And it's the giving of that kind of love in the face of all the evil that comes out of the matrix of fear. That is the way the peaceable kingdom can become a reality. And the redemption that Christ came into this world to effect is not just our relationship to God, but the whole material, animal, and human universe. If it could ever get bathed in love, if the fear could get cast out, then what it was God had in mind from the beginning could become a reality. It's really interesting. After Jesus spoke to the fish the way a beloved master would call trusting pets, and even the material, even the animal kingdom was responsive to love. It had nothing to fear in Jesus. After that happened, Simon Peter sees, as he has never seen before, who, in fact, Jesus was. And here you have the epitome of the face of fear. This is what the serpent has done to us all. Because when Simon Peter sensed he was close to God, and in the presence of the Holy One, his first word was, "Get away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." In other words, here is the fear from which we are to be delivered, being played out beautifully. Peter thought himself in the presence of God, and his response was to be absolutely terrified, because he still, at some level, thought that the Holy One was the exploiter and the abuser, and when he thought himself close to that one, he had nothing but fear. And how does Jesus respond? Thanks be to God, he did not answer that prayer the way it was prayed. He didn't go away from this one who knew himself to be less than perfect. You see, if you think that God is the exploiter and then you know that you've participated in destruction, then the notion of getting close to God would be indeed a most fearful prospect. But instead of Jesus saying, "Okay, you want me to move away, so I'll have nothing to do with you," what Jesus does say is what he came to earth to say to every one of us: be not afraid. Every time the God of the Bible comes close to human beings, the first thing that God always says is, don't be afraid. You don't have anything to fear in me. You don't have anything that I'm going to do to you. And what happened was that when he began to see that God was not fearful, but was utterly and totally joyful, then he discovered, to his great amazement, that God was more interested in his future than in his past, more interested in yet what Simon could become than all the things he had used to be. Here is the essence of the good news. That there's nothing we can do to make God love us any more than God already loves us, and nothing we can do to make God stop loving us, because when we became unloving, God did not cease to be love himself. He continues to be gift love. He continues to be unconditional love. And so he says to Simon, "You who I'm going to cast out your fear, you have been a fisher of fish up to this point. I'm going to elevate you into my own kind of realm. You are going to begin to fish for human beings. That is, I'm going to help you, Simon, so embody the love that I am, that just as my love has been able to call fish, your love is going to be able to call human beings back into relation to God and with each other. You are going to be part of the peaceable kingdom becoming real upon this earth." He did not hold Simon's past against him, because, hear me, though I've said it 1,000 times, God is much more concerned with what you can yet become than what you used to be. He is much more interested in the future than in the past. And if you can just believe that God's goodness is bigger than all our human badness, that God's willingness and power to forgive is greater than all the sinfulness, all the destructiveness that we have done, if you could ever see that where sin abounds, grace abounds even more, then you too can let go the past, however horrible it may be, and believe that in the grace of God there is a future for you that can be more godlike than anything that you have ever known before. And so it was that Jesus said, don't be afraid. I'm going to make something of you grander than you've ever dreamed, Simon. And they get back to the shore, and the text says that they left everything, and they began to follow him. Love had begun to take root where fear had taken over. One last comment about this story. It is so interesting that instead of going to the palaces of the Roman emperor, instead of going to the universities in Athens where the descendants of Socrates and Plato were filling the campuses, when love came to this earth to cast out fear, love came to a little occupied country called Palestine and went down to a little inland lake and there began to work with peasant fishermen. God always starts at the bottom. Nothing is insignificant or unimportant to God. And so God took simple fishermen and first cast out fear from their hearts, that through them he might eventually cast out fear in the whole world. It's amazing that he started at the bottom, just like in the beginning. He started with nothing and went through chaos to form in beauty. St. Augustine has an interesting comment on this. He said, God intended to call emperors to himself by fishermen instead of fishermen by emperors, so that the world would know that the kingdom rests on God's grace and not on human wisdom and human power. In other words, if he had converted the emperor first and then the emperor had set down some kind of edict, then we would have thought, well, maybe this is because we human beings are so powerful. The God that works from the bottom up, that takes the lowest and the least and uses those, the weak things of the world, to redeem the strong things, that kind of God can be trusted, and we recognize it as the grace of God, because how else would fishermen have been able to be empowered except that God was at work? David Redding says that all you have to do is to look at the church today, and particularly look at the quality of ministers, and realize that if anything good is being done, it's got to come from God. It has got to come out of some kind of grace that is bigger than the human material. And that is so true. My friend Sam Lloyd is a good friend of Dick Grine, Dick Grine is the Episcopal Bishop of New York. And you talk about a diocese that is absolutely complex. It has every stripe of radicality. It has everything in the world. It is seemingly from the outside pure chaos. And he asked Dick, he said, how on earth do you survive as the bishop of this diocese? And Grine said, I'll tell you exactly how. He said, I trust in God and I take God very seriously. And frankly, I laugh at the church about half the time. He said, we make so many foolish mistakes. We do so many faddish and dumb things. The church is forever falling on its own sword and tripping over its own toes. Let's face it, our Episcopal Church right now at the national level is in incredible dysfunction. But now the interesting thing is, if God works from the bottom up, if good is still being done, it's got to be the grace of God that's doing it. It's grace and not works that is the measure of what God is accomplishing. And if you tonight feel like you're at the bottom of the bottom, if you feel like you're about as insignificant and unimportant as any human being could be, and your situation couldn't get any worse, I want you to take heart that this God in incredible love always starts with the worst and the weakest and the lowest. And he willed to call emperors to himself through fishermen instead of fishermen through emperors, so we would know that the power is from God. The other story will not take as long to deal with. It's found in the very end of John's Gospel in the 21st chapter. Jesus has by this time been crucified. He has been resurrected. I won't take time to read the story because I think you know it. after the resurrection and all the upheavals that had taken place, Simon Peter and 6 others of the disciples go back to Galilee, and just to get grounded again, Peter says, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go back to something I'm sure of. So much has happened. I don't know what to make of it. And so he goes back to his net and back to his boat. He's doing what he remembered doing best. And once again, all night long, the fishermen had fished and they had caught nothing. Let me just pause and say that these 2 fish stories are different than most that you've heard, because in both of them, fishermen can't have anything to brag about, because in both cases, they had utterly failed. But as the sun was coming up and they're worn out, they see through the morning mist a figure over on the shore that they cannot quite make out, and they hear a voice. They must have had some sense of familiarity, calling across the waves, "Tell me, lads, did you catch anything?" Once again, remember, this is an expression of the one who cares for us, and not one who's trying to abuse us. Here is one that it matters to him if we work hard all night and don't get anywhere. What happens to us really doesn't matter to the good, the holy, and the good. And so the voice, when he calls out and they say, "We haven't caught a thing," the voice says, "Why don't you put your net down on the right side?" And so they did exactly what had been done sometime before, and the same thing happened. Love, for whom there is nothing to fear, called to animals. Remember now that humans from the beginning were existing over the earth and over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air. But that doesn't mean to exploit from God, meant for us to love and very good to practice love that is also like God. And when love spoke, they came expecting as they came to love. And once again, they are astonished that what they had not been able to do, Jesus was able to do. And to show you that love can take root in the heart, it can make it fun. John, the disciple, realized this was coming to and Simon Peter, in the first story, when he realized he was close to God, wanted to run and hide and say, "Get away from me." This because love he finally realized that God's goodness is rooted in our forgiveness, that the willingness to forgive in God is built of all the things that we ever faced will become as grandiose, egocentric to think our sins are too much for divine mercy. And Peter had lots that had happened since this first episode that he needed to confess. He had denied his Lord. He had boasted. He had failed. He had made a miserable, miserable failure of the last few days, but it had gotten through to Peter that where sin abounds, grace abounds. And this, he's the one that takes it. He and other people get there. That and there is love in Jesus and therefore in us that can take this fearful mess that we have created and can move it toward that peaceable kingdom where people can sit down together in the morning and have breakfast out of the generosity of the heart of God, and they can pass around the fish and they can pass around the bread. And lo and behold, the lion can lie down with the lamb, and the wolf and the child can play together without fear, and they will study war no more. It's amazing how John ends his gospel with this feeding there in the morning on the seashore. He began it, if you were here the first night, when he went to a wedding and a peasant family was running out of wine. And they were about to be embarrassed, and the whole thing was about to turn ugly. And Jesus, out of his great compassion, changed water into wine, did quickly what he usually does at a more deliberate place to save a peasant family from embarrassment. He didn't do it for himself, he did it for them. And so he begins in the evening by rescuing a simple peasant family. And the gospel ends with Jesus in the morning time feeding breakfast to some people who had known failure after failure after failure, but on whom God had not given up. If you want to know the truth about God, look at that generous host cooking breakfast and passing the bread and the fish around, and then look on through that to that one who is life and has life, and said one day, this is too good to keep to myself. I want others to know the joy that I experience. I want others to know the ecstasy of what it is to be and to have and to do. And the reason God created us in the first place was that we could get in on His kind of joy. And Jesus was full of joy that day by the seashore, feeding His beloved brothers. And love is the only power that can overcome evil without imitating evil. And it happened in history. It starts at the bottom, and every one of us are capable of receiving that love. And if you receive it, then you're set free to go and bear it to others. You can do miracles if you're willing to trust in love. You would be amazed at what an old woman in a nursing home can do when she begins to practice unconditional love. You would be amazed at how even the animals and the plants will begin to flourish if they sense in you there is nothing to fear, and therefore they can flower. And He's in the process of casting out fear from every one of our hearts. Therefore, I say to you tonight what Jesus always said, always: be not